Echoes of Justice. The Science and Soul of Solving Cold Cases. How do investigators solve cold cases? Introduction: The Ghost in the Machine. The file is usually thick, bound by rusted paper clips and smelling of damp basement air. The edges of the Polaroids have turned a sepia yellow, blurring the bloodstains into something that looks like spilled ink. To most people, this is a cold case, a failure of justice, a tragedy frozen in time. But to a new generation of investigators, this file is not a dead end. It is a puzzle that simply hasn't been solved yet. For decades, time was the enemy of the investigator. Witnesses died, memories faded, and physical evidence degraded. But the 21st century has flipped the script. Today, time is an ally. Time allows technology to catch up to the criminal. Time allows the fear that kept witnesses silent to evaporate. How do investigators solve the unsolvable? It isn't magic, and it isn't like the hour-long dramas on television. It is a grueling, methodical, and often heartbreaking process of digital resurrection. This book is a journey into that process, from the first time a detective reopens a dusty box to the final moment a pair of handcuffs clicks shut on a wrist that has been free for 40 years. Chapter 1: The Deep Freeze, Why Cases Go Cold. The Golden Hour and the Lead Balloon. In police work, there is a concept known as the golden hour. It refers to the first 24 to 48 hours after a crime is committed. During this window, the trail is hot. The suspect's DNA is still fresh on the scene, their getaway car still has the mud from the driveway on its tires, the witnesses still have the adrenaline-fueled clarity of what they saw. But sometimes, the golden hour passes without a break. Then the golden week passes. Then the month. A case goes cold when all logical leads have been exhausted. This is a technical term used by police to describe a state where there is nowhere left to turn. Every person the victim knew has been interviewed. Every license plate caught on a nearby camera has been traced. Every drop of blood has been tested against the existing databases. When the lead balloon drops, the case is moved from the active desk to the archives. It isn't that the police stop caring, it's that the math of crime is a brutal one. In a major city, 3 new murders might happen in a single weekend. The detectives must follow the heat. The cold case is left behind, waiting for a miracle. The psychology of the unsolved. To understand how to solve a cold case, one must understand the psychological environment it creates. There are 3 victims in every cold case. The deceased, their story was cut short, and the final chapter, the ending provided by justice, remains unwritten. The family, they live in a state of ambiguous loss. Unlike a family that loses a loved one to a car accident or illness, they have no closure. They look at every stranger on the street and wonder, is that him? Did I just pass the person who destroyed my life? The community, an unsolved murder is a puncture wound in the safety of a neighborhood. It creates a lingering sense of dread that someone got away with it. For the investigator, the deep freeze is a period of observation. They aren't looking for a new crime, they are looking for a crack in the ice. They are waiting for the suspect to make a mistake, for a witness to grow a conscience, or for a scientist in a lab 300 miles away to invent a new way to see the invisible. The tunnel vision trap. One of the most common reasons a case goes cold is tunnel vision. During the initial investigation, detectives may become convinced that a specific person, the husband, the business rival, the shady neighbor, is the killer. They spend 90% of their resources trying to prove that theory. If that theory is wrong, they ignore the small, insignificant clues that point elsewhere. When a cold case is reopened, the first task of the new investigator is to break the tunnel. They must look at the file as if they have never seen it before. They must ask, who did the original team ignore? What evidence didn't fit their story, so they tucked it in the back of the folder? Chapter 2, The Paper Trail, Reviewing the Original File. When a detective picks up a cold case, they don't go to the crime scene. They go to a reading room. The Art of the Case File. A murder file from 1980 is a physical object. It contains handwritten notes, often in cursive that is hard to read. It contains tip sheets, thousands of calls from the public, most of which are useless. The investigator begins a process called inventory and indexing. Asterisk the witness map. They plot out every person who was interviewed. They look for the silent witness, someone who was mentioned by 3 different people but was never actually brought into the station. The forensic audit. They create a list of every piece of physical evidence. Is the victim's clothing still in the locker? Is there a cigarette but that was found in the alley but never tested for DNA because DNA testing didn't exist yet? The inconsistency check. People's stories change over time, but the physical evidence stays the same. The detective looks for the glitch in the matrix. Imagine a file where a witness says they saw a blue car speeding away at 10 p.m. But the coroner's report says the victim was alive until at least midnight. In 1980, the detective might have just assumed the witness got the time wrong. In 2026, the cold case investigator asks, what if the blue car had nothing to do with it? What if we were looking at the wrong 2-hour window for 30 years? Chapter 3, The DNA Revolution, Decoding the Ghost. If the case file is the memory of an investigation, then DNA is its heartbeat. To understand how investigators solve cold cases today, one must understand that we are no longer looking for fingerprints alone. We are looking for the very blueprints of life. In this chapter, we step out of the dusty archives and into the sterile, fluorescent light of the forensic laboratory. The genetic time machine. In the mid-1980s, when many of today's cold cases were hot, DNA profiling was a futuristic dream. If a detective found a bloodstain at a crime scene, the best a lab could do was blood typing. They could tell you the killer had typo-positive blood, a trait shared by nearly 40% of the population. It was enough to exclude a suspect, but almost never enough to convict one. Today, we use STR, short tandem repeat, analysis. Think of DNA as a long book. While 99.9% of the text in that book is identical for every human being, giving us 2 arms, 2 legs, and a heart, there are specific paragraphs that repeat in different patterns for every individual. By looking at these specific locations, forensic scientists can create a numerical profile. The odds of two unrelated people sharing the same profile are often 1 in a quadrillion, thousands of times more than the number of people on Earth. The touch DNA breakthrough. For years, cold case investigators thought they needed a biological fluid to solve a case, a pool of blood, or a semen sample. But one of the most significant shifts in the last decade is the ability to recover touch DNA. Every time you touch an object, you leave behind microscopic skin cells. In a cold case from 1992, a killer might have tied a ligature around a victim's wrists. At the time, the rope was tested for blood, found clean, and tossed into an evidence bag. 20 years later, a cold case detective sends that rope to the lab. Using a process called MVAC, a high-tech vacuum that washes the fibers of the rope with a sterile solution, scientists can pull those ancient skin cells out of the weave of the fabric. Even after decades in a box, the DNA is often protected enough to yield a full profile. The killer's signature was there all along, we just didn't have the glasses to see it. The Cody's dead end. Once a detective has a DNA profile from an old crime scene, the first step is to upload it to Cody's, the combined DNA index system. This is the national database containing the DNA of convicted felons and arrestees. But here is the frustration of cold case work. The database is only as good as the people in it. If the killer committed their crime in 1985 and then lived a quiet life, never getting arrested for a felony again, their DNA will never be in Cody's. The detective is left with a perfect John Doe profile. They know exactly who the killer is genetically, but they have no name to put with the face. This brings us to the most revolutionary tool in the history of cold case investigation, forensic genetic genealogy. Chapter 4, The Family Tree, Turning Relatives into Witnesses. In 2018, the world watched as Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, was led away in handcuffs. He hadn't been caught by a fingerprint or a hit in a criminal database. He was caught because his third cousin had taken a popular home DNA test to find out if they were Irish or Italian. Public databases versus private privacy. To reach our 20,000-word goal, we must understand the mechanics of this genealogical dragnet. Investigators no longer just look for the killer, they look for the killer's family. When you upload your DNA to a site like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, you are opting into a global search. Forensic genealogists take the unknown DNA from a cold case and upload it to these sites. The software doesn't look for a 100% match, the killer. It looks for centimorgans, the unit of measurement for genetic linkage. 3,400 centimorgans means you found a parent or child. 850 centimorgans means you found a first cousin. 200 centimorgans means you found a second cousin once removed. The reverse build. This is where the investigator becomes a historian. Once a genealogist finds a cluster of second or third cousins, they begin the reverse build. They find the common ancestors of those cousins, perhaps a great-great-grandfather who lived in 1890. Then, they work the tree forward in time. They track every son, every daughter, and every marriage. They narrow the tree down by geography and age. Did this branch of the family live in California in 1978? Was there a male in this family who was between the ages of 20 and 30 at the time of the murder? Eventually, the massive tree of thousands of people narrows down to one or two names. This is not enough for an arrest. No judge will sign a warrant based on a family tree, but it is enough for surveillance DNA. The detective follows the suspect to a grocery store. The suspect throws away a coffee cup. The detective retrieves it, sends it to the lab, and compares the fresh DNA to the 40-year-old crime scene sample. If it's a match, the ghost finally has a name. Chapter 5: The Changing Tide, the Human Element. Science is the how, but people are the why. In this chapter, we examine why witnesses who stayed silent for 30 years suddenly decide to speak. The erasure of fear. In many cold cases, the prime suspect was known to the original police team. But the case couldn't move forward because the key witness was the suspect's wife, brother, or best friend. Time changes the power dynamic of a relationship. The death of the patriarch. If a suspect was a violent, domineering figure, his family may have been terrified to speak. Once that suspect becomes an elderly man in a nursing home or passes away, the vow of silence often breaks. The divorce factor. Loyalty is rarely permanent. A woman who provided a false alibi for her boyfriend in 1995 may now be a grandmother who looks back on that man as a monster who ruined her youth. The maturation of conscience. People change. A 19-year-old who helped a friend clean up a mess may now be a 50-year-old who can't sleep at night. The art of the cold call. When a cold case detective knocks on a door after 20 years, they don't start with an accusation. They start with a request for help. I'm working on the Sarah Jenkins case from '88. I know you spoke to the police back then, but we're just making sure we didn't miss anything. You know, technology has changed so much. The goal is to make the witness feel safe. The detective often finds that the witness has been waiting for someone to ask. They have been carrying the weight of the truth for decades, and the knock on the door is a relief, not a threat. Chapter 6: The Digital Crowd, the Rise of the Amateur Sleuth. For most of the 20th century, a cold case file stayed locked in a drawer, accessible only to those with a badge. If the police didn't talk, the public didn't know. But the digital age has democratized investigation. Today, a cold case is no longer just a police matter, it is a global conversation. The power of the podcast. True crime podcasts have evolved from simple entertainment into a legitimate investigative force. Shows like Serial, Up and Vanished, and Your Own Backyard have done something that police departments often lack the resources to do. They keep the story alive in the public consciousness for hundreds of hours. When a podcast takes on a cold case, it creates a social pressure cooker. Shaking the trees. When a host interviews old neighbors or retired cops, they stir up the sediment we discussed in earlier chapters. People who haven't thought about the crime in years are suddenly reminded of a detail, a car they saw, a strange comment a coworker made, and they call the tip line. Resource allocation. Public interest often dictates police priority. If a podcast reaches 5 million listeners, the local district attorney or police chief is under immense pressure to assign a fresh detective to the case. The web sleuth phenomenon. Websites like Reddit and specialized forums have created crowdsourced investigations. While this carries risks, which we will discuss shortly, the benefits are undeniable. Imagine a cold case where the only clue is a unique piece of jewelry found on a victim. In 1990, a detective could only show that photo to local pawnshops. In 2026, an investigator can upload that photo to a global forum. Within hours, a hobbyist in another country might identify the jewelry as a specific limited edition piece sold only in a small town in 1982. This distributed intelligence allows investigators to cover more ground than 100 detectives ever could. The danger of the digital mob. However, the court of public opinion is a double-edged sword. Investigators must often work against the public to protect the integrity of a case. Tip pollution. For every one good tip generated by a podcast, there are 10,000 theories based on nothing but speculation. This can bury a detective in useless paperwork. Alerting the suspect. If a podcast host becomes too aggressive, they might tip off a suspect who hasn't been thought about in years, giving them time to flee, destroy remaining evidence, or even commit suicide before justice can be served. Chapter 7. The Missing Victim, Identifying Jane and John Does. One of the most chilling types of cold cases is the unidentified decedent. These are cases where the police have a body but no name. You cannot solve a murder if you don't know who was killed. Forensic anthropology, the stories in the bone. When remains are found years later, a forensic pathologist's work is limited by the state of decay. This is where the forensic anthropologist steps in. They don't look at flesh, they look at the skeletal biography. Biological profile. Bones can tell us the victim's sex, their approximate age, and their ancestry. Lifestyle markers. A healed fracture in a leg bone tells us the victim had an injury years before death. Certain wear on the teeth might suggest they were a pipe smoker or played a wind instrument. The final seconds, perimortem trauma, injuries occurring at the time of death, leave specific signatures on bone. A V-shaped notch in a rib indicates a knife strike. A beveling on the skull indicates the direction of a bullet. Forensic artistry, putting a face on the nameless. Once the anthropologist provides the measurements, a forensic artist creates a reconstruction. Clay reconstruction. Using depth markers based on the victim's age and race, the artist builds a face over a 3D printed replica of the skull. Digital aging. If a victim went missing as a child 30 years ago, software can age their last known photo to show what they would look like as an adult. The goal is always the same, the spark of recognition. All it takes is one person looking at a digital reconstruction on a news site and saying, "That looks exactly like my cousin who moved away in 1984 and never called home." Chapter 8. Following the new lead, the methodical path to arrest. When a hit finally comes, whether it's a DNA match or a witness confession, the investigation doesn't end. It actually enters its most dangerous phase. This is the validation phase. Corroboration, more than a name. A DNA match proves the suspect was there, but it doesn't always prove they are the killer. Was the suspect's DNA there for a legitimate reason? Asterisk, did they live in the house? Asterisk, were they a delivery driver? Detectives must now build a circumstantial wall around the DNA. They go back to the records from the time of the crime. They look for employment records, gas station receipts, and old phone bills. They are looking for opportunity. They need to prove that not only could the suspect have done it, but that no one else could have. The sting and the swab. In many cold cases, the final piece of evidence is abandoned DNA. As mentioned in the Golden State Killer case, detectives will often follow a suspect in secret. They wait for the suspect to discard a cigarette, a water bottle, or a piece of chewing gum. This is a legal maneuver. Because the item was discarded in a public place, it is considered abandoned property, and the police do not need a warrant to test it. This surveillance sample is the final nail in the coffin. Once the lab confirms that the abandoned DNA matches the crime scene DNA, the handcuffs are finally brought out of the case. Chapter 9: The Legal War, Prosecuting the Past. The moment an arrest is made in a cold case, the clock starts ticking in a different direction. While the public celebrates a resolution, the prosecution enters a legal minefield. Trying a murder that happened 30 years ago is fundamentally different from trying one that happened last week. In this chapter, we explore the battle of the evidence that occurs in the courtroom. The dying witness and the hearsay rule. In a standard trial, the Sixth Amendment gives the defendant the right to confront their accuser. But what happens when the lead detective from 1982 has passed away? What happens when the primary eyewitness has succumbed to dementia? Past recollection recorded, prosecutors must fight to allow original police statements into evidence. They argue that because the notes were made at the time of the event, they are a more accurate memory than anything a surviving witness could provide today. The loss of cross-examination. Defense attorneys will argue that their client is being denied a fair trial because they cannot question the people who originally gathered the evidence. The judge must decide, is the DNA enough to override the silence of the dead? The chain of custody challenge. The defense's greatest weapon in a cold case is the evidence locker. In the 1970s and 80s, police departments did not have the rigorous barcoding and climate control systems they have today. A defense lawyer will ask, where was this sweater kept for 30 years? Who had the keys to that locker in 1994? Was the box ever opened or contaminated by another investigation? If there is a single gap in the paperwork, a few years where the location of the evidence wasn't logged, a lawyer can argue that touch DNA from a lab technician or a janitor could have contaminated the sample. The prosecutor's job is to prove that the evidence remained pristine despite the passage of decades. Chapter 10: The Burden of Memory, Testimony After the Fog. When a witness takes the stand to testify about something they saw in their youth, the defense will ruthlessly attack their cognitive reliability. The fading memory defense. Defense attorneys hire experts in human memory to explain to the jury how false memories are formed. They will argue that the witness didn't actually see their client, they saw a news report 10 years later, or a podcast suggested a face to them, and their brain filled in the blanks. To counter this, investigators look for anchor points. They ask the witness to describe things that wouldn't change: the weather that day, cross-referenced with meteorological reports, a specific song on the radio, or a traumatic detail that burned the image into their mind. The goal is to prove to the jury that some memories are etched in stone, not written in sand. Chapter 11, The Verdict and the New Normal. When the jury finally returns a verdict, it is rarely the end of the story. For a cold case, the ending is complex. The myth of closure. We often use the word closure in news reports, but many families find the word offensive. A conviction doesn't bring the victim back, and it doesn't return the 30 years the family spent in agony. Instead, investigators call it the final chapter. It is the transition from a mystery to a history. The victim is no longer a missing person or an unsolved case. They are a person whose story has been told and whose killer has been named. The success of the dead suspect. Sometimes, the DNA leads to a man who died 5 years prior. While there can be no trial and no prison sentence, the investigation is still considered solved. Posthumous justice, even without a trial, naming the killer allows other victims, who may have been afraid, to come forward. It allows the police to clear other unsolved files that may be linked to the same man. Conclusion: the future of the past. As we move further into the 21st century, the deep freeze is thawing. With every person who uploads their DNA to a genealogy site, the world becomes smaller for those who think they have gotten away with it. The message to the criminal is clear: time is no longer your friend. You can change your name, you can move to another country, and you can live a blameless life for half a century. But your DNA is a silent witness that never forgets, and there is a detective somewhere, perhaps one who hasn't even been born yet, who will eventually find the key to your box. The solve rate for cold cases is rising every year. We are not just solving crimes, we are honoring a promise made to victims decades ago: you will not be forgotten, and justice has never truly expired.